No, I know. I just turned it on. Yeah, we're good, right? Okay. Check. Yep. You want the boys to go downstairs? Hmm? Right. What's that? They can go with Mandy.
It's a picture from that tournament.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool.
There's $4 there.
We on now? Yeah, okay, good. All right, well, thanks for coming. Welcome to section 3 of our Finding Financial Balance workshop here. I wanted to start tonight by kind of talking through some questions first. I wanted to see if anybody had any questions about the budgeting process, if anybody tried to go through that over the last couple weeks, and if you had any questions or concerns about how that looked. No? I had some feedback from some people, a couple of different folks, and they found money they didn't know they had, which is kind of cool, right? I mean, that tends to happen when you budget. And you kind of, it's kind of an awakening to where that money is going that you don't even realize. Sometimes it's really hard in your everyday life to realize that, I'll start the morning with $20 in my pocket, and I get to the end of the day and I've got $1.20 left. And I'm like, man, where did that $19 go, right? And then you got to think back to it. And then as I think through it, I'm like, well, that was a stupid purchase. And, well, that was a stupid purchase, and I really didn't need to eat lunch out. Boy, I could still have $20 if I would have just eaten the peanut butter and jelly sandwich that I had already packed, right? So anyway, no questions about the budgeting process, though. Yes?
Not a question so much as a comment. I found it interesting that, we did our budget for November, and the next column over is actual.
Yep.
And it struck me that, that's a real good way to refine going forward.
Yep.
Because it's hard this first time to come up with those exact numbers.
It's almost impossible, right? And things change month to month. I mean, even utilities, this time of year, in Ohio, it's 75 one day or 85, and the next day it's 32. And so, you're burning electric for the AC one day, and the very next day you got the gas on. And so you're going to go through some months, and then, you're going to have months where in November and December traditionally, your food budgets are going to be higher. Why? Because you have Thanksgiving and Christmas. And so you're gonna have blips like this. The interesting thing about budgeting that I find, and so I do this for my business specifically, but I think it's a real good idea from a family perspective even to do this, is I make 3 budgets every year for my business. I make a pie in the sky kind of, boy, I really hope I hit this kind of budget. I hit the sky is falling and I'm going to go out of business budget, right, if everything goes really badly. And then I make the budget where I think I'm going to land, right? Because for me, in planning, and, I do this somewhat in my personal life too, but I want to know, like, if the wheels fall off, right, if everything goes wrong, am I going to be okay? Am I going to be able to survive till the next set of opportunities come, right? And so that's why I make the real bad one, and then I make the real good one to say, okay, if everything goes right, if everything's perfect, and I get, this windfall of available funds, what do I want to do with it? I want to start planning that now, because if goodness knows, if I've got $100 extra sitting in the bank, I've got somebody at home that has already spent it twice, right? My wife loves Amazon, and they love her. It's cool, right? I say that in jest because we're both pretty good about spending. She does that a little bit more than I do, but anyway, so I make 3 budgets every year, and then at the end of the year, I go back and I put my actuals in and kind of lay it out where it fell. But I think you're right. I mean, from a refining perspective, you're going to change that as you go, because you're going to see that, I only budgeted $500 for food and I ended up spending $600. So guess what your budget is next month? It's $600 or $625, right? And it works the same way in business. So, if I have an advertising budget this year of X dollars, and I say it's going to be $4,000 and I spend $5,000, well, next year my budget's going to be 5 or 6, right? Because, it's not going to go down very likely, right? And so you're right. It's a very good adjustment tool, using that at actual. Yeah.
Well, 2 things. We're at a point where we're looking at downsizing. So downsize to me is one thing, to Denise.
It's completely different, right?
And so we came up against a very similar decision-making process. That was,
Yep.
we can do this, but how do we do this, and what has to happen elsewhere to do that?
That's right. Yeah, there's always a cost, right? Yeah.
Those things don't have to change.
Right.
That was a great illustration of that, making choices, how to make choices, those kind of important choices. So, appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It would be great if I could figure out a way to not make the way my checks go through the bank dependent on how much money's in the account. You know what I'm saying? Like, I wish that I could write any check and have it clear regardless of the balance, right? If I could only come to this agreement with the bank, everybody would be happier. Well, except for the bank, right? So it's, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's always a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. So the other thing I wanted to do before we got started tonight was I wanted to talk about a couple of the overriding themes in these that you filled out the first week, and I took some time to kind of go through them, and it was interesting because we've got people in here that some have very robust incomes and some don't, but the interesting thing is that a lot of the themes are pretty overriding, right? I mean, they're the same through and through. From a security standpoint. And so I just wanted to share some of them and kind of give my kind of feedback. And some of the stuff we might have already talked about, but I wanted to kind of address them directly, and certainly offer that if anybody wants to chat after this is over, in the evening, or if you want my number and you want to call me at home, I'm happy to do that. If you want to talk about any of the questions specifically. But one of the questions was, how do we, if we have growing bills and declining income, how do we handle that? Well, there's only 2 ways to do that, right? You either have to generate more income or spend less, right? I mean, really, those are your only choices, or build debt, right? We talked about this in the first session, and that's tough sometimes. And what people don't realize, I think, today is the amount of stuff that they have in their house that has value that they could sell, that other people who like stuff would love to buy. I mean, they could really generate some money, and maybe pay off some debt by just doing that. I mean, I can't tell you how many closets full of junk, I call it junk, but it's stuff that we paid money for, right, that we have laying around the house. And this is part of the reason I don't want to move ever, right? Because you really know the amount of junk you have when you have to actually pack it into a U-Haul and ship it across the city, right? And so I don't want to rip that Band-Aid off. My son can figure that out after I'm gone. He can go through and find all the gems. It's cool, right? So the interesting thing, though, is that a lot of people aren't willing to sacrifice their stuff for the peace, right? For the security. And I wanted to share one particular story, and so I have a client who has a rental house, and the guy is buried in debt. I mean, he's buried in debt, but he's got a rental house, and this rental house generates him less than $3,000 a year. I mean, really not a whole lot of money, right? And so I'm having a conversation with him, and I'm like, well, look, you've got like $60,000 in equity in this house. Why not sell it? You could pay off almost all your debt. And he's like, but the rental house is my retirement. And I'm like, not at $250 a month, it's not, right? And so he wasn't willing to let go of that thing that he was holding because he thought it was an asset, and it is an asset, right? But he's buried in 18% debt to generate $3,000 a year. He was paying more in interest than he was earning. And I couldn't get him to see that it was the better choice was to liquidate the asset and eliminate the debt, right? And so that, the one thing that I saw overall was, how do I plan for retirement? And one of the things, I would say, first of all, seek a professional's help, right? You want the person who's right for the job giving you the advice. And I am not a retirement planning professional, right? I've got my own ideas of how I'm planning for my retirement. I'm still 20-some years away from that, so I've got a lot of time to make a lot of mistakes. Just like you wouldn't want me being your personal trainer, you probably don't want me planning your retirement either, right? So you want to seek the advice of a professional, first of all. But I think the real good thing in talking about tweaking your budgets, I think it's a real interesting thing if you take a budget and say, what do I want my budget to look like when I'm retired? And penciling out, okay, if I don't have a mortgage and this is how much money I have coming in, this is how I'm going to be able to live. And basically, that's what retirement professionals do, is they figure out, okay, what's the lifestyle you want to lead? How much are you going to spend doing that? And do you have enough money to cover it? And you can do that on your own by just creating a future budget, right? What is it going to look like in 5 years? Now, I know that you're not going to know what the cost of natural gas is, or, the cost of a gallon of milk, but you can give yourself a pretty good idea. I mean, we know that, food increases by 1 to 2% a year, right? You can kind of look at, a short-term forecast, right? I wouldn't, look at a budget for in 20 years, but if you're looking at 5 to 7 years, you could certainly do that for yourself. Excuse me. The other one that I saw a lot was paying for college. And so it's interesting because, my wife and I have already started talking about this with my son who's 10, and we've already started kind of down that path of planning and how we're going to afford this. Because, right now, university's $30,000 a year, $40,000 a year, $50,000 a year some places, right? And, I can't pay for that. So, he's going to have to get a job like tomorrow, right? Well, but truthfully, I mean, I think that college planning has to be inclusive of the kids. And so we've actually already started having conversations about college with my son, and talking to him about where are you going to be able to go, and where obviously what he wants to be a fireman today. I mean, I'm joking about that, but he doesn't know what he wants to be. But talking about that decision making process, we've already started that with him. What I see a lot with folks is and I want the best for my kid, but they will go to the ends of the earth for their kid, to their own detriment sometimes, right? Where they'll say, and I'm picking on Dayton only because I just had a client the other day whose kid is going to Dayton, and it is over $50,000 a year to go to Dayton, with housing and everything included. And they were bemoaning the fact that they were going to have to cash out retirement funds and do these things to achieve this college. And what I said was, I said, okay, at the end of the 4 years, does it really matter where the degree's from? Right? I mean, because yes, your kid, I'm sure my kid when he's 16 is going to want to drive a Maserati too, but he's not going to get that, right? So he might not be going to Dayton either, right? And so I think there has to be a tough conversation to have with the kids to say, look, based on what we can afford as parents and where we want you to be financially when you exit college, that's not a viable option, right? We've got to pick something else because, there are certainly other universities that will do just as good a job in that particular field that aren't going to break the bank and make me have to work 10 years, until I'm 75, right? I'm not interested in doing that. And on the flip side of that, I also don't want my son to leave college with $300,000 in debt, right? I think that's a bad deal for him too, right? He's going to be saddled with that for his life. And so I think there has to be a real tough conversation with kids. But that being said, investing in a 529 plan, is a great idea because that's tax-free money. Putting money in Roth IRAs if your kid's working. At 16 years old, they can invest money in Roth IRAs. These all grow tax-free. Those are good vehicles to help cushion that blow. Goodness knows what's going to happen with financial aid at that point, right? I don't know what's going to happen with the tax code in 3 months, let alone, financial aid in 10 years, right? So setting aside some money now to at least cushion that blow so that you're not assuming so much debt when that time comes. And then the big one, and I saw this on a few as well, was, and this is going to kind of kick off what we're talking about tonight, was how do I enjoy life when I can't afford to do anything? And I was talking to a friend a couple years ago whose uncle was he was getting ready to pass, right? He was old, he was in hospice, and we were talking about it, and he said something to me that kind of rang true with me, and I really believe this is true. He said, look, when it all comes down to the end, he goes, happiness for me is the view and who's sitting next to you. Right? All I want is a good view and somebody to talk to. And so I think that when we start talking about contentment, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, you have to look at what your expectations are and what you're thankful for, first of all, because really, I could deal without a whole lot of stuff if I just had those two things, right? I mean, those are more important than just about anything else. And so we're going to talk tonight about contentment and what that means. Now, we've already talked about the commitment and what God wants us to do with our money, right? We've talked about the discipline and how to budget. And now we get to the really hard part, right? Because the other two are kind of like, it's like, following the directions on the board, right? And contentment is real tough because it's different for each of us. I can't tell you what is going to make you content. I can tell you what makes me content, right? I can tell you what helps me get there. But I can't tell you what that's going to be for you. So let's first define contentment. So it's a state of happiness and satisfaction. And that's not a singular state. It's a state of being, right? It's not a destination. It's kind of how you travel. Does that make sense? And so when you're talking about contentment, it's not, you're not going to get there and all of a sudden, like, the sky opens up and the sun shines down and you're like, I finally made it. Everything's done. It's going to be that way for a while, and then in 5 minutes, you've got to figure out again what's going to make you content in 5 minutes, because things are always changing, right? Our world changes by the second. People in our lives change in a second, and so we're constantly looking for that place of contentment, that happy place that we find. So what is it, though? I mean, really, for me, it's this kind of crazy mix that starts with gratitude, being thankful, right? It starts with that. You got to work in some peace and humility. There's some understanding that everything's temporary, right? Everything that we have is temporary. And then there's this confidence that no matter what else happens, that God's going to provide what we need for some bare bones minimum, right? It's not always going to be what we want, but we're going to have what we need. And if you can get to that point where you can kind of have that peace where you can rest on God, you can rest on Him, and just say, okay, come what may, I'm going to be okay. It makes a world of difference. I then can forget about the stuff and focus on what's really important, which for me is the people, right? It's the people. So in 1 Timothy, God's got something to say about it. And in fact, so this is Paul who's written a letter. And what he's responding to is he's responding to people who are trying to make money from being godly, right? I mean, that's kind of what's going on in the background here. But what he says is, he said, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. And I want to stop before I read the last one, because the last one is a very famous piece of scripture, which is, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. But talk about that last piece. And I think people misquote this more often than they get it right. Because it's usually stated, for the love of money is the root of all evil, of all kinds of evil, right? Or evil. They even take out kinds of. It's not the, it's a. It's a root. It's not the only one. The love of anything other than, the love of anything that's being put ahead of God is a root of all kinds of evil, right? If I take and I say that, my love of food is more important than my love for God, that's going to give me some problems. If I say that about my stuff, my money, even my friends, that's going to cause me problems. And it's interesting. I'm going to share a story here, and this is a little bit earlier than I was going to share this, but I'm going to kind of give you my journey with the church and in and out of the church, because my wife kind of led me to understand this. So when I was 12, my mom died. And I was angry, right? I'm 12 years old. I don't really know what's going on. And at that point, I stopped going to church. I stopped. 13 years. And during that time, I thought, I'm going to be a self-made dude, right? I'm going to control my own way. And I got myself into a whole mess of problems, right? Both in relationships and financially. And I moved to California because I thought that that's where I was going to find who I was. And through a bunch of stuff that happened, I ended up right back here in Ohio. And I met my wife. And about, I'm going to say, and she'll tell me I'm wrong, but that's cool. It's 6 or 8 months into our dating. She looks at me one day and she says, if we're going to be together, you're going to go to church. And I'm like, what? I'm like, and truthfully, this was my answer. I'm like, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I can do it, right? I got wounds that are deep. I don't know. I'll try. And so I came for a Sunday, and then I didn't come for a Sunday, and then I came for a Sunday, and then I started coming more Sundays, and now we're 20 years later, and here I am, right? But what happened is as I came back and kind of reestablished that relationship, I started asking for things from God. And I asked him for peace and direction. And I started focusing on not about who I was, but maybe who I wanted to be and who I wanted to be to other people, right? And my focus then became less and less about the money and the things of life, and I'm more interested in spending time with my family than I am about anything else. And not that being content and driven can't coexist, because they do. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But she kind of pushed me back here, right? She pushed me this way, and I'm so thankful for that. It's really made all the difference. So I've had times in my life when I've really made substantial money, especially for the age that I was, and to look back in my past and look at the amount of waste and the amount of stupid decisions I made for what, right? For nothing. Just kind of interesting. But does contentment equal happiness? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Because here's what I'll contend with you. Do you think you can be happy without being content? For short periods of time, I think you can. And truthfully, our economy is based on the idea that you can absolutely be happy without being content. They don't want you to be content. They want you to find happiness in the next thing that you purchase, right? That's what they tell you all the time. What you need is, what you want is, right? And so I think that you can go through periods of time, short periods, where you can be happy in short periods, but that kind of fades away if you don't have the contentment that you're looking for. On the flip side of that, can you be content and not be happy? And again, I think you can, but it's going to happen for short periods of time. Because if you're content and you're unhappy, the unhappiness will wash away pretty quickly. And I'll share another story that happened this summer to me. And this is just true. This is just evidence that I don't have it all figured out, and I'm constantly searching for this stuff. But this summer, we go on a vacation every summer with my wife's family, and we went to Williamsburg this summer, which is not my idea of a great vacation, right? Not my cup of tea. And I was pretty salty about it, right? So I wasn't very happy about it. I was actually irritated the whole time, and I let it get control of me. And it ruined my week. It ruined it. And I'm stomping around like a kid, like an idiot, And then I get home, and I'm like 3 days home, and I'm doing something out in the yard, and I'm like, man, I'm stupid. Like, what was I thinking, right? I'm on vacation. I don't have to work. I could be in the back of a garbage truck. Like, why would it matter, And so I actually I went and apologized to my wife and to her family because of how I acted. I mean, and I wasn't like mean or rude to anybody, but I was like, gosh, man, I should have been thankful just to be there. And so, but I think that if you're finding the contentment, the happiness, or the unhappiness, generally melts away pretty quickly. All right. So talking about contentment and passion, or contentment and being driven, can they coexist? And the answer is absolutely yes, they can, and they should. Because contentment, a lot of times, is associated with being lazy, and I don't think that's the case at all. Contentment is a peace. Laziness is just not wanting to do anything. I think the people that are most content are the people that are really passionate about things that aren't about things, if that makes sense. They're really passionate about biking, or they're really passionate about church or God or their friends or their family. They're passionate about their life and not passionate about the stuff. Does that make sense? You could even be passionate about work and about driving your business. I think unless it's to, buy the jet, right? If that's your only goal, I think you're going to be pretty unfulfilled because you're not going to have the biggest jet in the fleet, right? So the question is it better to be poor or rich to find contentment? What do you think? Poor. Yeah? Okay, better to be poor? Anybody else? Anybody would say rich? You say rich? Okay. So the interesting thing is that, people say that the rich have all the problems, Rich people, it's fun, right? It would be fun to be rich, right? To go out and do the things that you want whenever you want to do them. To buy the things that you want or need, or to help people that you want or need to. I mean, being rich is cool, I guess, right? As long as it's not at the sacrifice of something else. So the interesting thing is that there was a study done, and they compared two groups of people. So they compared Forbes' 400 richest people. So these are the 400 richest people in the world. And they compared them to the people, the Maasai people in Kenya and the Inuit people in Greenland. So both of them have no electricity or running water. So we're talking about the people who have the very least, right, as far as material possessions, and the people that have the very most in material possessions. And what do you think happened? Who do you think was more satisfied? Equally. They were equally satisfied, right? Which, by the way, wasn't very satisfied, right? They were equally satisfied. The point being is that it's not really about being rich or poor, because certainly you can be somebody who has sworn off all of the things in life and still not be able to find contentment. And you could also be that person who is born with a silver spoon and has everything you ever wanted and not be able to find contentment. And I think I might have told you this before, but what they find is that in the American public, at least, that the magic number in a family is about $75,000. So at $75,000, people aren't more happy. Because at that point, their basic needs have been met, and then it's just more money, more problems. Right? That's really what it boils down to. And so, at the same time, you have people who are on both ends. You know, there are people who give away all their stuff, and you know, there's this trend right now for tiny houses, and they buy the tiny house, and they drive their house all over the country, and you know, live in 400 square feet or whatever they do, right? They can find happiness. The other interesting thing that just happened, and it's the first time it's ever happened, I believe, is that the writer J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter series, right? One of the richest people in the world, by the way, for the first time ever has been taken off the Forbes list because of her charitable giving. That's pretty cool, right? I mean, it's kind of amazing that this is the first time that anybody has given away enough of their money to get pulled down off that list. And I'm not saying that she's content. I'm just saying that that's just an interesting look at somebody who's doing something different, right? So when we talk about money, you know, we say how much is enough. Well, you know, I said that $75,000 was kind of the magic number in the U.S. But talking about the very wealthy, right? And we'll talk about one of the richest Americans ever. Now, obviously, by today's standards, not, but John D. Rockefeller, right? He's an Ohioan, one of the richest men in the U.S. in U.S. history. So he was, at one point, the world's richest man. He was America's first billionaire. And so there was a reporter that asked him a question, and you know, many of you may have heard this, but they said, "How much is enough?" And his response was, "Just a little more than I have now." And I'm like, wow, how frustrating would that be to live that way, right? I mean, yeah, that's a driven businessman, right? But at what point is enough enough? And, you know, you hand the keys to the next person and say, good luck, and I'm going to go do the things that really enrich my life. And maybe work was it for him. Maybe it was. But, you know, I can't picture that point of view. So if money doesn't matter, what does? You think age matters? What's that? You think so? Do you think younger is more or older is more content? Okay, so you think people that are younger are more content? Yeah? Okay, so the interesting thing is another study was done, and this is kind of how it stacked out. So the people that were 10 to 20 years old, and we're talking about on the 50 scale, this is about 50%, and these are round numbers, right? About 50% of the people in 10 to 20 years old are pretty content. And then as we get into our 20s, it goes down, and as we hit the 30s and 40s, boy, life isn't so good. Only about 1 in 3 people are content. And then as we get a little older, it slides back up. So why do you think that is? Well, I think that the reason this happens is that it all has to do with our comparisons to each other. Right? Because when you're 12 years old and your buddy's wearing the new Jordans, I really could care less. Right? When I was 12 years old, it did not matter to me. And maybe for some kids it does, but I think most kids are like that. And then as we get into our 20s and we start to earn money, it's kind of all about, you know, how much am I earning? What degree am I getting? What are my friends doing? How much are they earning? And it gets even worse into your 30s and 40s when you're really supposed to be an adult, right? Because then you're really worried about that stuff. And then once the kids are gone, right? You've provided for the kids. You're in your late 50s and entering into your 60s. It gets a little easier because then you're like, what was I thinking? Right? It doesn't really matter, right? You kind of figure it out over time. And so I thought this was an interesting illustration of how our contentment runs. And it really doesn't surprise me that the very young are content. What really surprised me is that we're least content when we make the most money, because really we make the most money between the time we're 30 and 50, right, on the average, right? People are making more money during those years than any other time, and yet they're less content. So age does matter. So I shared this verse before, but I think it's important here again. Again, Paul talking in Philippians, he says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And I think that that's really the most important thing. I think really the tough times, and whether that's financially, physically, personally, I think they allow us a window into being more content because it allows us to focus on the things that are really important. If you've ever talked to somebody who survived a really bad cancer scare, right? They don't care about getting a new car. It's not important. They're happy to be here, right? Somebody who's gone through a time when they've lost their job and been out of work for a year or 2 years or 3 years, and now they're kind of on the upswing. They're not worried about the stuff. They're happy that everything's just being cared for, right? So what's the source of contentment? How do we find this? So Solomon talks about contentment quite a lot in Ecclesiastes. And we all know that Solomon was the wisest guy that ever walked the earth, right? He asked God for that peace, and he was granted the wisdom. But yet he still had trouble with contentment. Wisest guy that ever walked the earth, still trouble with finding that peace. And a couple things that he said, first of all, this is in Ecclesiastes 2:10. He says, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold from my heart any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor. And this was my reward from all my labor. So he's basically saying, look, I worked hard and I partied it up. Right? Sounds like my 20s. So he had triumphs, and he was finding happiness in those triumphs, but he couldn't find the contentment. And so then he says, all things are full of weariness, a man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. He's basically saying it's all worthless unless you have God, right? Unless you have something bigger, unless you have something more that you're passionate about, doesn't matter. And he ends, and I don't know where, oh yeah, there's the one, okay. In Ecclesiastes 6:7, all the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied, right? He's bemoaning the fact that all this work and all this triumph that I had, and yet it's still not enough, right? I am not finding the satisfaction that I'm looking for. And he ends Ecclesiastes with this, though, because he comes to a conclusion. And he says this, he says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. He said that's the key right there, right? And so when he talks about fearing God, it's not, okay, be afraid. He's saying, listen to him. Focus. Don't worry about the stuff. Don't worry about the accolades. Don't worry about the money. Do what he's asking you to do, and life will be great. And so I think that our first source is gratitude. Being thankful, right? And it's tough sometimes because we go through periods of time where we don't think that there's a whole lot to be thankful for. One of the things that we started doing with my son a few years ago, and one of the things I think that, this works amazingly well for our household. And this was one of the things that after our vacation kind of got me back on track, to being like, boy, you're an idiot, is that we have a way of praying at meals. So when we're at home and we sit and have a meal together, we pray at each meal. But we do it a little differently than other people do. And so what we do is we go around the table and we have to share one thing that day that we're thankful for. Every meal, right? And so, my son, he likes to pick one thing and then just lay on it, right? And just that's my one thing. But we make him change it every time, right? Because there's always something to be thankful for. And a lot of times what we're thankful for is the things that we don't really want. So like the rain, right? I don't really want it to rain, but I'm thankful for it because I know that the earth needs it, right? So I give God thanks for that. Or when, my son played in a soccer tournament recently, and they had a couple rough games. And we were thankful for a team that played hard because it wasn't about the winning, right? And so that's one of the things that we do on a daily basis to kind of keep us focused on that gratitude, because we know that things could be much worse, right? In the grand scheme of things, we have it pretty darn good. We just got to keep reminding ourselves of that, right? But our brains immediately want us to go to those things that we don't have rather than focusing on the things that are good in our lives. So in Job talks about contentment as well. 36:11. If they obey and serve him, they will spend the rest of their days in prosperities and their years in contentment. And he's again talking about serving God, right? He's talking about serving God and being content in that. And I know that this sounds funny when we're talking about money, but when you focus on the stuff that he wants you to do, everything else kind of falls away. And one of the questions that I was asked earlier, and I hope I'm not putting anybody on the spot here, but it was, talking about, when I talked about the God portion last time, what if I want to put it over here and give it to this group instead of this group? And I'm like, it doesn't really matter. That's your choice, right? If you are putting that first, and this has been my experience, whenever I put the money that I'm going to give first, I never worry about the money that I need because it's always there. And I think the rationale behind this is that once I've made the decision in my life to do what I'm supposed to do with my money, to share it with others, to be a blessing to others, as soon as I've made that decision, I know that I'm already being conscientious enough about it in my own life to have enough, right? Certainly I could not give as much and buy some cool stuff, right? That's a choice. But if I made the choice already to do what's expected of me, what God wants me to do, then all of my needs are met. And oh, by the way, I can be thankful for the opportunity to do the giving. Back to the gratitude piece. So what does it mean to obey and serve God? Again, I think that's different for everybody. For me, it's listening to my wife, right? That's part of it. It's being a good husband as best I can, trying to be a good dad, try to be part of the church and an active part of the church, and more importantly for me, I think the key is to be a blessing to others. That's what God calls us to do, right? To treat your neighbor as you would yourself. after you love him first. Right? You take care of that first. You love him with all your heart, your soul. And then love your neighbor as you love yourself. So treat your neighbor as well as you treat yourself. And if you do those two things, it's pretty easy, right? It's pretty straightforward. I think if everybody just did those two things, and I'm not saying in this room, but in the world, if everybody did that, it'd be amazing how much happier everybody would be, how much less strife we would have. So talking about the source of contentment, what's the source of discontentment? Because on the flip side of every time that you can be grateful, there's the flip side of that coin, right? And I talked last week about the power that we held in our pockets, right? With our wallets and our cell phones and our keys and all the money dangers that we carry around. And truthfully, I think that one of the biggest dangers that we have to our own happiness sits in our pockets for most of us, right? And it's this thing. It ruins people. And this is my reasoning. I can see in seconds where everybody else in the tri-state area has vacationed, what new things they bought, what new dog they got, right? I mean, Facebook, you turn off notifications because otherwise it would be buzzing 24/7, right? And I think the internet, truthfully, is like a Pandora's box that we've opened from a happiness perspective, because there's just too much information. There's too many things to want. And so I think that we've got to be careful when it comes to those devices that we don't allow that to be a feeding point for our discontentment. Because I think it really is for a lot of people. Because the truth is that discontentment comes from partial materialism, but really it's from things like jealousy and greed and gluttony, right? Let's talk about some of those deadly sins, right? And so we spend all of our time comparing ourselves to everyone else instead of being thankful for what we have. And so this brings me to the exercise that I handed out earlier. And I'm sorry, the Hanleys were a few minutes late, so they didn't get any. And this will work just fine as well, right? So picture this, right? And this is kind of how our lives run. I gave everybody some candy, but not everybody. Not quite. But most everybody got some candy, right? Now, who got their favorite kind? Nobody got their favorite kind. You got one, okay? All right. How many did most people get? 3? 3 pieces? Yeah? Okay. And how many did you get? How many's in there? There's 40. 40. Right. Exactly. Well, and truthfully, this is how life goes with God, right? Because we do not get to choose. And one of the questions when I was walking around is, can I trade something I got for something else? Right? And this is how our lives work, because when we're born into a family, we don't get to trade who our parents are. And in fact, we don't get to choose to get more candy out of the gate or not. Right? It's just the truth of it is that some of us are gifted with a bigger bag of candy than others. Right? The question is, though, are you thankful for getting any candy at all? Because these two folks didn't get any. Right? And maybe they're thankful they didn't get any, because it's bad for you, right? But the point being is that as I was going around handing it out, I wasn't giving you a choice, right? And this is how life works. We're born into the family that we're born into. We're born in the financial situation we're born into. The question is, can you be happy with what you've got? And oh, by the way, I gave you 3 for a reason. Because if I give you 3 pieces of candy, how many do you really need? 1. So you've got some to share, right? And certainly my expectation would be of the people that got the full bag of candy, that there is a greater expectation of you to share more. Good luck, Andy. Yeah, right. Right. But does that make sense though? I mean, it's kind of the same way, where I didn't choose to be born the last of 12 kids into the situation I was born into, but I'm thankful for the blessings that it's brought, right? It's been great. And even over the period of our lives, as we're looking at the things that we've had or have currently, and really more importantly, the people that we deal with, is that I'm thankful for the time that I got. And really for me, the stuff are just opportunities for me to enjoy time with the people that I want to spend time with. So my father-in-law, at some urging of myself and his son, right, because we instigate the guy quite a lot, this summer he purchased a pontoon boat, a used pontoon boat. And he didn't buy it because, he didn't really buy it because we wanted it, because he would just told us to, sod off. But, what he bought it for is he said, look, if we can have more family time because this thing is there, then it's money well spent. And really that's what it ended up being. We were able to spend more time with people that we care for because it was a destination for people to get away from their everyday lives and enjoy the time, right? It was less about the money or the thing and more about the experience. And so it's, as with any boat, it's going to be a money pit. Thankfully, it's his and not mine, right? This is why I wanted him to buy it, right? Smart move on my part, right? So anyway, so if you're in a situation where you've gotten the big bag of candy, don't be afraid to spread it around. You'll be a lot more content for it, I would guess. What's that? You're the only one that got the whole bag of chocolate. The other one got Starburst, and those are good, but, you got mini Reese cups, so, there's something to be said for that. Oh, let's skip that for a second. So, really what it's about in this financial journey that we're taking is it's not about how much you have. It's about having enough to satisfy the basic needs that you need, right? And then having enough to provide a blessing to others. And finding that balance, that contentment that we're all looking for. I think living a life with focus is important to that. And like I said, the focus is up to you. And really, as you go through different seasons of your life, that focus is going to change, right? Because right now, I've got a laser focus on providing for my family and a 10-year-old kid that if I could squeeze an extra, 30 minutes a day, I would do that, right? And then he's going to be 35 someday, right? And then my focus might be on grandkids or something else at that point, right? And so, but living with focus, and really, it's easier to find contentment when you're living for other people and not for yourself. And I talked to you about, Christmas, and, we got Christmas coming up, and how I don't like giving gifts. Or getting gifts, excuse me. I like giving gifts. I don't like getting gifts. But partially that's my way of kind of filling my tank of gratitude, being able to say, look, I love the opportunity to provide, to give to other people, right? And so I think that that's really at the core of what finding that financial contentment is. Having enough for yourself, but really starting with making sure that you're doing for others first, right? That's the ticket. All right, so we have some homework, and we're going to finish a little early tonight. I'd like you to try to do something for the next week. So there's 3 meals a day. I'd like you to give thanks for 3 different things each day. So we're talking about 21 different things to be thankful for. It's not as hard as you think. I think that we all have way more than that to do, right? And then next week's going to be the real fun one. So I hope you all come back for next week. It's going to be good. You're going to like it. So thanks, and we'll see you next week. There you go, Andy. We're done early.